Good evening and a very warm welcome to the University of Leeds. I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight to the Great Hall for what promises to be a truly inspiring evening. So I'm Lisa Roberts and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University for Research and Innovation. So the University of Leeds was established as a university in 1904, but we can actually trace our roots back to the Leeds School of Medicine from 1831. So it seems quite appropriate that we should be here this evening to think about the most amazing and powerful of human organs, the brain. It's a real privilege and pleasure to welcome our eminent panel. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our chair for the evening, an alumnus of Leeds herself, Dr. Mary Baker.
And can I add my welcome to you? Thanks so much for coming. I was at this university and spent 3 of the happiest years of my life here. So thank you for coming. Well, you saw that was about the year of the brain. And we did not want to put on a program about a diseased brain. We wanted to celebrate the healthy brain. Achievements in art, literature, music, discovery, science, going to the moon. But you know, there is, and I can say this as a sociologist, there is an assumption in our society that brains are just for the brainy people. There are achievements, you know, the examinations that people have to pass and the degrees that people take. There is this assumption. But I want to show you, and I'm sure you will get from this evening, that the brain is your sat-navigation for your life. And it's not always about achieving things. Sometimes it's about failures, disappointments, rethinking. And it is the brain that gets you back on track. It is such a wonderful, vital organ. And I think really has a sat-navigation for your life, developing its resilience from your failures, reconnecting things, mistakes, bad choices, bad decisions, setting that direction right. And tonight you're going to listen to a man where things went very wrong for him, that he had to show every bit of resilience in his body and his brain to get himself out of the situation that he found himself in. But first of all, before we get to Terry, I want to introduce Professor Trevor Jones. Now, Trevor was the former Global R&D Director of the Wellcome Foundation and Director General of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. And he's going to tell us a little bit of how this brain works and what happens when it goes wrong. Trevor, good friend, you're so welcome.
Thank you, Mary. And it is a joy to be at this wonderful university. I'm going to talk about the supercomputer that is our brain. No other computer in the world has yet been able to simulate the brain, despite being able to deep convolute space and space science and the genomes and so on. It is a supercomputer better than anything else man has ever made. And as Mary says, it has all the features of producing things that are learning, but also our emotions. We have learned over the years to find out which part of the brain works in different areas. So, for example, memory and behavior tend to be influenced by this frontal lobe of the brain here, whereas reading and language tends to be over the back here. Now, how do we do that? Well, we can actually put electrodes on your skull and monitor all those little brain waves, brain electrical patterns, or we can put you into a scanner and scan the brain whilst you're doing things. So, for example, if we do that and give you a sip of lemon juice, very sour, then the brain will react to that. If we give you a sip of honey, the brain will respond to that. And you can then look at where that might be. These are spatial pictures from the Wellcome Foundation Museum in London, showing those areas that are stimulated by these different kinds of stimuli. And then that gets to a very complicated pattern of where, in fact, there are in the brain those regions. Of course, the question is, could we interrogate those regions and find out what's happening when we are in love, when we are listening to music, when we are in fear, when we have a disease condition. And that's the challenge that is ahead of us, both in medicine as well as in the science of the brain. So looking through the eye, which is the one window onto the brain, the other, of course, your ears and your nose and your touch, instantly you can see things you remember. You can see, you recognize those instantly, even though, you know, they don't have a label on them. And I bet you if you think back to, you know, when you first went to school, or who your granny was, or, you know, where have you been on holiday, or maybe somebody you've only met once or twice, then there's an instant sort of recall. This massive computer is able to bring all that memory back from where it's been stored, like your little gigabyte laptop or whatever. You know, it runs out of memory. Well, this thing doesn't do that. And then it plays silly tricks on you. If you just stare at this picture, some of you will notice it looks to be moving round. It's not moving round, it's absolutely stationary. But your eyes are trying to work out what all that is, and your brain's trying to adapt to it and try to figure out, with millions and millions of electrical signals, what's happening to that pattern. So here we are. The brain, with different regions, can go through all sorts of emotions, but also appreciate all sorts of art and science. And the question at the bottom is, do we ever forget anything? It's a bit scary, isn't it, that the journey you took here tonight, you never forget. If we could actually interrogate you in 10 years' time on the right way, we might find out that you do remember which bus or car or train or plane or whatever you got to get here. So where does this all store? How does it all, and how do we dig it back out of the brain? Well, you can imagine when the child is born, its brain isn't fully formed. It's got all the connections and it's got all the size of the connections, but it's not fully developed. And as the little baby's growing and learning to crawl and walk and then to talk and then to react to mummy and daddy and then to not like things, the brain is learning those functions. When you get to be a teenager, it sort of over-expresses a lot of that, and there's a sort of pruning of that as you get towards the end of being a teenager. But if you have a very bad accident and the brain is damaged, then it's amazing how the other side of the brain may take over command of what was this side of the brain's function. It's plastic in that regard. So it's quite wonderful how fearfully this has been made and how wonderful it reacts. Now that's because it's got lots and lots and lots and lots of little pathways, networks of proteins, and each of them has at the end of that a sort of gap, a little, we call it a synapse, and the electrical signals trigger the release of what we call neurotransmitters, little bits of chemical that cross those pathway voids and are responsible for the actions you take. If you burn yourself, you pull your hand away because the brain sent transmitters down to move your muscles. And all of those functions are in this neural network of millions and millions and millions of interrelated pathways. But when it goes wrong, and I spent my life in medical research and trying to find new pharmaceuticals, then you have to see whether we understand enough to actually hold on to that. So here's epilepsy, where normally your brain is making a lot of electrical signals, but if they go crazy, then the neurotransmitters can cause you to have a seizure. So what we've been trying to do, and done very successfully, is to find something we can put at that gate between the neuron and the pathway to actually stop that neurotransmitter causing that epileptic reaction. And that we're very successful in doing that, and many people, as you know, can live essentially normal lives with the medicines that we have. It's not the end of the answer. We need to be able to repair that, but it's a very good step forward. Similarly with Parkinson's, no relation to the Parkinson building we were in, which I think is the Parkinson's law of work expanding to fill the time for its completion. But Parkinson was a physician in Shoreditch and noticed people with a poor gait and tremor. And he described this condition. And years later, we found that at the base of the brain, and you'll see some wonderful exhibitions upstairs afterwards, some of the real great stuff going on at this university in neurological research. There's a place we call the substantia nigra, and it releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, if that's not being released, you simply can't function properly. So have we been looking at treating that? Well, by putting substances into that gap that are medicines, they're not dopamine itself, they're like dopamine, that then degrade and produce dopamine to supplement the body's dopamine. Or to put medicines in there that actually stimulate whatever's left and released in that area to increase the amount of dopamine that we require. And now some very, very interesting research going on to see if we could do gene transplants to actually repair the damage that's been caused and the reason why the dopamine's not occurring. In our laboratories, we've got all sorts of new ways of doing this research. We have to use animal tissues before we use human, but we now can actually, in a very small chip, put some of the tissues of the brain and see whether we can simulate whether if you take a medicine orally, goes into the stomach, absorbed into the bloodstream, up to the brain, does it get across the blood-brain barrier? So this is the brain on a chip. And more, this is the kind of research we do to find new medicines. Now, what about stroke? You know what happens in a stroke. There's two kinds, ischemic and ordinary stroke. So if you suddenly lose blood flow to your brain, that area where the blood is very in poor supply could then shut down and cause damage to the cells. And so you get a stroke. Maybe you can't move your left or right side. One of the really exciting advances here is to use stem cells. Now, when a baby is born, all right, we've got sperm and egg make one cell. That divides 2, 4, 8, and so on. All of those cells can make anything in the body. And then at some point, some cells, I tell you what, you go and be brain, you go and be muscle, you go and be liver. And the ones that are there for the brain, we can extract and grow in a test tube and re-implant them into a patient with a stroke. So here's a patient here with a drill into the cranium, and then we inject into that some stem cells that will only ever make brain cells, and they release substances to create networks. And this is really the most advanced stuff we're doing in that arena. Not there yet, but it looks as if we got some good results coming through. How about this then? This is a rat in a cage in Singapore, and it's been trained to press a little button with its nose, and when it does, it gets a reward, some food. Not like that, but like that, right? So it gets this reward. And if we then take that same experiment, but this time thousands and thousands of miles away in Carolina in North America, and put the same kind of little hat on the rat that we would on the human, then the rat in Singapore does what it's been taught to do, gets the reward, and the one in Carolina, without any knowledge of it, repeats it. It's a brain-to-brain transmission from animal to animal. Now, do you think we could do that for humans? Well, here's an experiment at Harvard a year or so ago, where a brain impulse from this chap here to a little cuff on the rat causes the rat's tail to flick. So that's human to animal transmission. Now, could we do human-to-human transmission? Well, here we are at Harvard again. Two researchers, the other side of the campus, one playing a game on his computer, the other one holding his hands over a computer, and exactly what he's doing is what the rat did the other side there. So, you know, it's possible we can do that sort of thing. Maybe we can actually start putting sensors. This is like a little tattoo that goes onto the skin, and it could have little circuits there that could detect your mood, your electrical transmissions, and so on. And that could be very useful in the Internet of Things and the way forward, that all of your homes will have sensors on your refrigerators and your air conditioning and so on, even in the driverless car. So if you're being driven along and it detects that you're fearful, it could slow down, so it makes you more calm. And you could use this to look at the mood and sense of people and lighting and so on. And that can be done externally with the knowledge of what your brain is telling us. And that's artificial intelligence. Now, the dangers, of course, of that are very carefully explained by Stephen Hawking, that unless we actually understand the implication of this and determine who's going to be part of the understanding, then it could be a real problem for us. So let me just show you one bit, lastly, of science advances that's taking place. We've just committed $4 billion over 10 years to see if we can map these electrical stimuli from the brain to make a computer on Earth that is as good as the human brain, to find out all those pathways, and it's not there yet, but that's the plan. And we call these brainbows. We can look at mood, lemon juice, and so on, and start to interrogate all of that function. And of course, if we could then correct that for some of these conditions like Parkinson's and like epilepsy, wouldn't that be just wonderful? But couldn't we just rewire it from somebody outside if we don't like what you're thinking or we don't like what you do? To rewire your brain without you knowing it? So Alexa, switch me off. It's just a joke. So folks, tonight we're going to see upstairs some wonderful experiments from the Leeds University. We're going to hear some wonderful experience of this marvellous supercomputer, the human brain. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that was a wonderful starter for us, Trevor. Thank you very much indeed. Now, come on, Lisa. Let's see what Leeds can do. Now, I've known Lisa. I met her when she was at Surrey University, and we were very sad to see her go, but it's your great gain. Lisa, what's Leeds up to?
Okay. So, as Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation at Leeds, I could probably take up the rest of the evening telling you how great the research is that we do here, but I've been given about 10-15 minutes, so I'm only going to be able to give you some highlights about the great things that we do and point you to some great research that you can hear about later after the talks this evening. So as a university, our strategy and mission can be really summed up in these two phrases that we use a lot in the university. A commitment to providing the very best education and experience for our students, and also to undertake world-class research, but research that has economic and societal benefit. And as a Russell Group University, we're very proud of the fact that we place equal emphasis on both of these things, our education and our research, and actually are recognised for doing so externally. So the university is the third largest university in the Russell Group, more than 33,000 students from 151 countries, and we have 7,800 staff. And some of you may know that we were awarded the University of the Year 2017 in the Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide. And the latest National Student Survey gave us the highest score joint in the Russell Group for overall student satisfaction. And we were recently awarded a gold rating in the new Teaching Excellence Framework, TEF, which is the highest rating possible. So our strategy for research is really focused on increasing the volume of what we do, the quality of our research, but of course the impact of that research on society. And I have to say we're already doing very well here, so we're already 10th in the UK for our research power. So an analogy I sometimes use is that we're already a 2 Michelin star restaurant, and what we're aiming for is firmly establishing ourselves with that 3rd Michelin star. So we're a true global leader. So one of our major strengths at Leeds is our ability to work across the disciplines to answer some big research questions. And the breadth and the depth of our research means that we do this really well. So we have 6 grand challenge interdisciplinary research themes that bring together researchers from across the university to tackle really difficult questions that need different perspectives across science, engineering, social sciences and the arts. Questions such as how we ensure a safe and sustainable food supply across the world, how we create safe, healthy and productive cities. And these are all areas where Leeds has the size and the capability to make major contributions to these global challenges. So it's not just our own brain power that we harness across campus. We also bring together the minds of wider academic collaborations with other universities, but we also have very strong partnerships with public, private and third sector partners to tackle these questions. And of course, those big questions need to be underpinned by the very best research infrastructure or enabling platforms. And these are the things that truly set Leeds apart and allow us to conduct the best research, but importantly, to attract and retain the very best researchers. Recent investment in some of these areas here is allowing us to stay ahead of the pack. And if you go to the displays later, for instance, you'll hear about the £17 million recent investment in structural molecular biology, which is allowing us to tackle questions around infectious diseases and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Some of our robotics research is helping us live longer and healthier lives. The Bragg Centre for Engineering Materials is the home to the Henry Royce Institute at Leeds, and our recent investment in imaging and advanced MRI is clearly having an impact on health. And finally, work in our Institute for Data Analytics is having a really profound effect on how we diagnose and treat disease, cancer, in the Leeds City region. But clearly investing in great kit and infrastructure in itself will not lead to world-leading research. We also need to couple this with investment in people, recruiting and supporting the development of future research leaders. And again, this is something we do very well at Leeds. Our 250 Great Minds programme is recruiting early career academics and established professors to Leeds. And these are aligned with the investments in postgraduate researchers, so supporting development across the whole career pipeline. I mentioned the impact of our research earlier. It's crucial that the research and innovation from Leeds is used for societal and economic and health benefits. And more than ever, it's important that we work with industry and other external partners to generate that impact and have that impact on society. And in order to create a real step change in the way we do this, we've got a really exciting initiative coming on stream next autumn. And that's the opening of Nexus, our new innovation centre. So this innovation centre will not only be a building on the edge of campus, you may have seen it as you walked up the hill, to nurture startups and SMEs in both state-of-the-art lab and office facilities, but it will act as a real gateway for external organisations to access the great capabilities and expertise that we have in the university, a real gateway for what we're calling collaborative innovation. But of course, new challenges and opportunities arise all of the time, and we need to ensure that we're well positioned to respond to those. So just a flavour of some new initiatives that we're working on currently within the university. The Sir William Henry Bragg development is the largest capital project the university has ever undertaken, and we've just started this project. £96 million investment to integrate all of our engineering, physical sciences and computing activities to really foster those interdisciplinary approaches to research and education. And we're really proud of the fact that the development will be named after the Nobel Prize-winning professor who worked at Leeds, Sir William Henry Bragg. Just last month, we launched our new High-Speed Rail and System Integration Institute with huge support from the rail sector and industry. And this again will put us on the global map because we'll have facilities here unrivaled outside of Japan. Last month, we also launched our doctoral college to provide great student experience for all our postgraduate research students, as we do for our undergraduate students. Our Global Food and Environment Institute will address global challenges of food security, sustainable development, and dietary health. And we also aim to solve problems of diabetic heart disease within 10 years. So, there are many ways in which the great minds at Leeds are looking to the power of the brain. I'm just going to mention 3 themes which will give you a flavour of aspects of some of our research, which we'll hear more about later. So, for example, we're working to understand what actually goes on in the brain for people suffering with conditions such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and how cancers develop and spread, in order that we can clearly develop better treatments. We have other researchers looking at the relationship between pain and the brain, while others are examining how our environment shapes our psychological development. And if you're curious to know more, or even to find out what a neuroscientist really does, I hope you'll be able to stay for half an hour after the lecture this evening, and have an opportunity to go and talk to our researchers working in these areas over a cup of tea or a glass of wine to find out more. So we will have a food and drink reception on offer in Parkinson Court, where you registered earlier this evening. So please do stay and join us and talk to our researchers. In the meantime, I hope that you have a better idea of some of the ways Leeds is continuing to harness the brain power of some of our greatest minds in the UK. And I'd like, at this point, to hand back to Mary.
Thank you very much indeed, Lisa. I must say it's very impressive what is going on up here. Keeping up the good work. Good, I'm so pleased. Thank you. Well, now I want to turn the clock back. We've had a wonderful setting of the brain power, 2 very good presentations. And now let's go back, and I'm looking well into the audience. Some of you, you see, are too young to remember 1985, but I'm glad to see there's some faces there that will remember 1985. It's January. It's cold. We're at home. We put the radio on, and this is what we hear.
There's still no news of the whereabouts of Mr. Terry Waite, the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy, who disappeared in Beirut 8 days ago at the start of his latest mission to secure the release of Western hostages there. Neither the Foreign Office nor Lambeth Palace received any information overnight. The Foreign Office said this morning that the British Embassy in Beirut had been checking with its contacts, but neither they nor the Druze militia who are guarding Mr. Waite knew anything. The Prime Minister has described Mr. Waite as a unique man who commanded worldwide respect. During a visit to Dagenham, she was asked by BBC Radio News if she thought his mission had been ill-advised.
Terry Waite is a man of enormous courage and bravery, and he believes in trying to do whatever he can to help hostages of whatever nationality. He makes his own judgments. He's that sort of person. We have no bad news, except that we have the Lambeth Palace is out of contact.
Do you have any words?
We hope, as everyone else does, that we'll soon have him back.
In Beirut itself, there is little but rumour and speculation about what's happened to Mr. Waite, but the recent wave of kidnappings in which 11 foreigners have disappeared has prompted a huge demonstration by students from schools in the city. 4 of those who've been kidnapped are professors at the Beirut University, and their abduction has angered the students.
Now, I remember that announcement. I was at home in a warm place with central heating. I was secure. Terry Waite was in a very different setting. He was alone. He must have been frightened. And he was very unsafe. And he's going to tell us more about this in a moment. But just before Terry speaks, I think it's very important we understand something else. And I'm just going to ask Professor Richard Morris, who's a neuroscientist, professor of neuroscience at Edinburgh University, just to reflect on 3 very, very important words: fear, resilience, and solitude, because they're going to appear much more when Terry speaks. So, Richard, just give your reflections, please.
Thank you, Mary. It's a great privilege to be here by way of introduction to our main speaker, Terry Waite. And as you've heard, what I want to do is to say a few words about fear and resilience and the underlying brain mechanisms that are thought to mediate these 2 states of mind, and then make some comments about solitude, a way of life that has interested Terry for some years. Now, I think we all have some sense of what it is to be afraid, to be alone, and what it means to be resilient in the face of fear. But speaking for myself, and I guess most people here, we've never had to face the levels of abject fear, suffering, discomfort, uncertainty, boredom, and solitude that Terry had to face all those years ago. But to try to set the scene, let me begin with a slightly curious story. We British have a long-standing sense of fair play, liberty, and freedom, and their importance in life. From Magna Carta in 1215 through the 800-year period to the Great Reform Act of 1832, and then even the Brexit vote of last year. We Brits value freedom and liberty in slightly quirky ways that reflect, I think, the complexity of our character. And so my story is this. On the 1st of July, 2007, the day the ban on smoking in public places came into law, I made a trip to London, in which the last part of the journey was by tube, and I got out at one of those older stations. I think it was Goodge Street near University College London, where I was going. And it's an old station, so it only has a lift, it doesn't have an escalator. So lots of us duly squeezed into the lift, which began very slowly to move up to ground level. At this point, one person in the crowded lift lit up a cigarette. A few moments later, a somewhat pompous man with, forgive me, a strikingly aristocratic accent said loudly, "Don't you know that smoking is now banned in the underground?" We all stayed absolutely silent, desperately trying not to make eye contact with each other, but no doubt all wondering what would happen next. A few moments later, another person spoke in what was, for me at any rate, a much more empathetic tone of voice. "Well, this is a free country. He's free to break the law and pay the consequences if he wishes." Whereupon an even deeper silence descended upon the occupants of the lift, which carried on its slow journey to the surface, all of us pondering this somewhat existential moral dilemma. Terry lost his liberty in the Lebanon for 5 long years of solitary confinement. But as you'll hear, and we will know from reading his amazing book, Taken on Trust, he chose not to lose his freedom. That he achieved this, at least in part, and through some dark periods, reflected his amazing strength of character. Now, his resilience was, of course, exceptional, though I suspect, and looking around the room, there will be others here who've been tested in difficult situations, notably in wartime. And then there's this more everyday sense of resilience, such as required of athletes training for a marathon or something like that, or carers looking after an elderly spouse or a relative with dementia, day after day. There's surely some people in that position here tonight. So Terry's experience, while very unusual, may echo in your minds as you face your own ordeals. Terry's job on behalf of the Anglican Church before he was taken hostage required him to have very difficult negotiations with untrustworthy people, and then he was, as he put it, taken on trust. So what is it that enables people to cope with fear and uncertainty and to display resilience? What happens psychologically? What's happening in the brain? Well, several factors have been identified through research, of which the first is maintenance of good relationships with close family members and with friends and with others. And we're gradually making progress in understanding aspects of what's called attachment and its underlying mechanisms. And neuroendocrine mechanisms involving hormones, such as the hormone oxytocin, have been shown to be causally important for social attachments in experiments in both animals and in people. Effective attachment in early life is now thought to be extremely important in developing a resilient personality. Now, a second aspect is to avoid seeing crises or stressful events as unbearable. A key aspect of coping with stress appears to be the degree of control a person has, and clearly Terry had very little in his situation. But can a person take actions to avoid or reduce pain, or do they just develop a sort of state of learned helplessness and give up? Now, stress induces the release of cortisol into the bloodstream, which then acts on receptors in various parts of the brain. It turns out that some brain areas, such as the amygdala and hippocampus, involved respectively in fear and in memory, possess what's called a high affinity corticosteroid receptor. That is, it's a receptor which reacts to circulating corticosteroid at very low levels. Other brain areas, such as the frontal lobe, involved in decision-making, as Trevor was telling you, possess only a more low affinity receptor, such that the shutting down of action and of decision-making that its activation triggers does not occur until much higher levels of corticosteroid are achieved. So the result is what's sometimes called an inverted U-shaped function, whereby a little bit of stress can be good for you and can be detected by the brain and acted upon positively, pep you up, so to speak. But a high chronic level of stress is bad for you, and to all intents and purposes, it's incapacitating. Now, another thing that is thought to be important in being resilient is to develop realistic goals in the circumstances you find yourself and try to move towards them. And as he may describe in his remarks, Terry also took a number of actions that helped him to turn a ghastly situation into one where he could gradually develop realistic goals for each day. Now, for the rest of us, there's that old World War II poster which we've all seen, "Keep calm and carry on." Well, sure, yes, but that message has to be supplemented by some specification of what the carrying on would consist of, and specifically how to give each day some kind of meaning in whatever plight you're in. And then finally, to look for opportunities of self-discovery and self-confidence, to take care of one's mind and one's body, exercising regularly and paying attention to one's needs. Now, Terry's a big man, as you can see, and his prison cell was often small, but he did manage to exercise, and even when he was kept in the dark for days on end, he tried to listen to the sound of the calls to prayer from the nearby mosques to have some sense of the time of day. And this is described in Taking on Trust. Reading that book, it's striking how much he put into action precisely what he needed to retain some level of sanity in what, for most of us, would have been a near impossible situation. Many a lesser man might have given up or thrashed out angrily, and he didn't. Now, there are lots of passages in the book that jump off the page, but one, for me, intriguing turning point in his autobiography, and I've mentioned this to Terry before, forgive me saying it again, but I think it's, for me, very moving, was his decision as a young man to join the church army and to serve as a lay rather than an ordained member of that organization. And he quickly grasps that there is a modest but committed sincerity of the people who serve within it, and who do so for very little tangible reward. In one passage, he describes a church army hostel in Middlesbrough on Teesside, just to the north of here, to which he'd been assigned. And he writes as follows: "I looked around at the drab dormitory, and then at Captain Kinsey, who was his boss, and I tried to imagine what it must be like to spend a life drifting between prison and hostels, and to be caught in a routine that offered little joy. How could Kinsey maintain his optimism year after year, seeing little results for his efforts, facing constant disappointment and letdown? I respected him for his commitment and determination. Working against all the odds, he was showing a compassion for his fellow man more powerful than 1,000 sermons." Now, Terry went on to display those very qualities during his captivity. He maintained some measure of dignity against the odds and continues to do so to this day in his humanitarian charity work. Now, what about solitude? We humans are social animals. I greatly value the love and company of my wife and my young son, and our frequent contact with Monica's family in Spain and my much older daughters in London and in Australia. And then in terms of my social life, there are my colleagues to talk to and their vicissitudes to tolerate. And life in a university such as Edinburgh, perhaps Leeds is very different, I don't know, would not be normal without a dash of academic politics to keep our minds active. Now, Terry's experience of solitary confinement led him to reflect on the state of solitude itself, why people choose a solitary life, how they cope with it. And he has a new book published by the SPCK Press entitled Solitude, Memories, People and Places. And he'll surely say a few words about his understanding of solitude. But let me put a last few words of introduction. In it, he likens solitude to a journey, a long journey of discovery, to be taken slowly, step by step, passo passo. And in the book, he describes visiting people who've chosen to live in the Australian outback. And he discusses why they came, what they've experienced, and the characters they became over time through living in such incredible isolation, thousands of miles away from the big cities of the east of Australia. Terry got there in a small plane, flown by a very self-effacing Australian bloke called Neil. And during the journey, Terry mentions to Neil that while he was incarcerated in his prison cell, Terry's own daughter came here with some university friends and drove across the outback all the way to, I think it was Darwin on the north coast. "I know that road," says Neil, as they fly along. And a while later, he brings the plane down under the cloud cover and shows Terry the road. Terry was understandably moved by seeing it and thinking of his daughter all those years ago, exploring this wilderness with her friends as he lay in his cell in the Lebanon. He also describes meeting a couple, John and his wife, who happens also to be called Terry, who had made their home in an extremely isolated place, and how John's wife, Terry, there are rather too many Terrys in this story, but anyway, we'll get there. She was brought up as a devout Roman Catholic with all the duties and rituals of that religion. And she comes to the outback, and she gradually assumes a love of the country and its solitary way of life as she simultaneously loses her Catholic faith. And to quote, "I became so good at being self-sufficient that I shut out the world. I didn't welcome people and I didn't meet people because I was here in this incredibly beautiful place. I didn't miss the Sunday place of worship because I was surrounded by creation. There is such beauty in this country, and I didn't realize that when I fell in love with John, I would fall in love with this country as well." You have this sense of solitude as a journey. And she goes on to describe solitude as the greatest gift by being given, leading Terry Waite himself to reflect on how this remarkable lady approached solitude in a particularly creative way. But, I think we also have to take on board that not everybody manages to cope with solitary confinement so well. And Terry himself describes some dark times. Talking about the issue a few weeks ago with an American neuroscience colleague of mine, I was amazed to discover that solitary is quite widely used in the American prison system, with some prisoners having as much as 23 hours a day on their own for very long periods of time, in some cases years. Given this situation, neuroscientists have now teamed up with lawyers to raise questions about the impact of solitary confinement on the body and the brain, and specifically to help bridge a divide in American law and culture between physical and mental injuries. The reason for this is because American jurisprudence does not, in general, view mental harm as a violation of the 8th Amendment of the US Constitution. And that amendment disallows cruel punishments involving demonstrable physical harms. And because it is so worded, appeals in court about the mental harm of solitary confinement fall on deaf ears. However, experiments in animals and non-invasive brain imaging in humans have now provided clear evidence that physical changes do take place in the brain and that these can sometimes be recognized as definitively deleterious. Now, the devil's in the detail here. For as I mentioned earlier, short periods of mild stress can be beneficial, and the changes in the brain may enable successful adaptation, a bit like the changes of the hippocampus of the London taxi drivers as they learn about the city. But where things cross the line from mild to moderate and then on to severe will involve judgment as well as evidence. Professor Jules Lobel, a professor at the Pittsburgh School of Law, and Dr. Huda Akil, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan and former president of the US Society for Neuroscience, will shortly publish an article about these issues in Daedalus, the journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, we don't yet know all the mechanisms of brain and body that enable men and women to face hardship and stress in successful ways, or to rise to the challenge of solitude in creative ways. What is the relevant early experience to help people to become resilient? What is the impact of stress on hormonal control systems and the architecture of neural circuitry in the brain? However, what we do know is that Terry Waite developed the grit to carry him through his faith, his diverse experience as a young man, which I've touched on, dignity, composure, sense of purpose, and as I'm sure you'll hear, a dash of gentle humor. They served him well. Let us then hear from the man himself.
Well, at last we've reached the man I'm sure that you've really all come to hear. It's my great privilege and with great affection, Terry, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Mary. I had no idea what Richard or any of the speakers was going to say this evening. And Richard reminded me of one amusing story that is in the book Solitude, to which he referred. I was interested in different aspects of solitude, and I went to see George Blake. That name will not be known to a number of people here, but some of you may remember that he was a double agent. He was working for MI6, and beneath the surface, he was working for the Soviets. And he was captured, caught. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison, and he was in Wormwood Scrubs. And he escaped by loosening the bars, or the bars of the cell or the corridor were loosened. Prior to his escape, he came to the bars, he pulled them apart, extraordinary thing to do, and he escaped over the wall and eventually turned up in the Soviet Union. Many years later, I went to see him because I was interested in how he coped with the solitude of a double agent and the solitude of a life now lived in Russia. And I agreed to meet him just outside the Kremlin. He said, we live a short distance away, let us travel together. So we went on the metro. And he was living in a large KGB block, full of retired generals and what have you, surrounded by a large metal fence. And we came to the fence, And he said, "It's rather a long way to the main gate. Do you mind if we take a shortcut?" I said, "No, not at all, George." And true as I stand here, he went to the bars and he pulled them, and we got through. I said, "Old habits die hard." I am something, I suppose, of a guinea pig tonight. I shall simply recount some of my experience, and I hope that later in questions you will draw, not just from me, but from the experts here, the experts on the brain, something of what perhaps was taking place in my brain and in the brains of others who find themselves in situations of stress and of difficulty. I was captured, as you know, in Beirut. The story of why I was captured is a long one. I'm not going to repeat it tonight. I've written about it in the book Taken on Trust, and you can read about it if you so wish. Suffice to say that I found myself in an underground cell. This cell was tiled, and it was one of several cells underground. When I entered that cell, my blood ran cold, because I knew that these places were tiled because they were easier to clean after people had been knocked around. And I wondered just what I was to face. The first thing, as I sat there on the floor, I said to myself, well, perhaps this won't be long. And then I said three things to myself, and to this day, I have no idea why or where they came into my mind from. I said, no regrets. Don't regret what you have done. I had been promised safe conduct to see a hostage who was about to die. That safe conduct was broken. Don't regret taking that decision. If you regret, you will be demoralized, and you cannot afford to be demoralized. Second, no self-pity. Don't feel sorry for yourself. There are others in far more difficult circumstances. If you allow yourself to be sorry for yourself, you will be demoralized. You can't afford it. No over-sentimentality was the third point. And by that I meant, don't say, if only. If only I'd been a better husband, a better father, spent more time with the children. You can't live that part of your life again. You must now learn to live with yourself and your past as you are. Now, I cannot say for one moment that I kept absolutely those 3 points. But whenever I felt that I was becoming sorry for myself, I reminded myself of those 3 points. I was angry. I was very angry with myself for taking such a risk. I was angry with my captors. And I've written in the book, Out of the Silence, a short verse about anger. It goes as follows, as far as I can remember it. Anger is like a consuming fire, seeking all whom it may devour. Do not extinguish the flames totally, but warm yourself by the gentle glow of the embers. By that I was saying, I realize that if I allowed anger to take me over, I would be consumed by it. I would be destroyed by it. And I couldn't allow that. I couldn't get rid of it completely. It's a normal, natural human force. And somehow I had to learn how to use the force that had been generated by anger and try and divert that in ways that hopefully might be creative to myself. I had to show to myself that I still had a measure of freedom, even though I was detained. And I did, initially, what many people do when they are, first of all, incarcerated. I refused all food. I didn't eat for a week. After a week, they said, if you don't eat, now we shall make you eat. And by then, I had in some way controlled anger, and I ate. The conditions in the first year were reasonably severe. I was chained by hands and feet to the wall for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day. One visit to the bathroom for about 10 minutes. I slept on the floor. I had no books or papers or anything to read for a period of about 4 years. If I was in a room above ground, metal shutters were put in front of the window so no natural light entered. There was no exercise of any length of time. Occasionally, the chains would be removed and I could walk around the cell. But that was occasionally. Most of the time, one was immobile, sitting on the floor in a room that was simply a bare room. In that situation, I wondered if, in fact, I would lose my mind. I had heard of people who'd been kept in such conditions and who had lost their reason. I had actually experienced and seen one person I can remember who was kept as a hostage, who somehow cut off all communication with other people. He wouldn't speak. And in so doing, he began to cut off that inner dialogue that we all have and entered into this deeply depressive state, which, of course, sent him into a mental condition for which he did not recover completely following his release. And so I realized that there was a danger here. This danger was accompanied, the fear of losing reason was accompanied by physical torture. It was mistakenly believed by my captors initially that I was an agent of a foreign power, and they tried to extract information from me. I've written in the book, Out of the Silence, about that experience, and I think if I don't mind, I shall read this to you. They came at night, footsteps in the corridor, a key turning as fear grips my stomach. I lie still on the floor, blindfolded, sheltering beneath my thin blanket, seeking protection, seeking what scrap of security I may find. Sit! The command echoes round the cell like a shot from a pistol. Chains tug at my limbs as I struggle to obey. My wrists and feet are seized as locks are removed. Stand! I stumble to my feet. What is happening? Why at this hour do they come? Can this be release? Do I stand on the brink of freedom? My arms are gripped as we move out of the cell into the unknown. There are many in the room. I hear laughter, words uttered in a half whisper, words I cannot understand. Sit! I crouch and sit. Sleep! I lie on my back. The room falls silent. What you say? Now I understand. Another interrogation, another bout of questioning, another seeking for answers I cannot give. What you say? The voice is louder, insistent. Nothing, I reply, nothing. Something lands on my face, a pillow perhaps. I struggle to breathe as the pillow is held down. What you say? Someone holds my legs. Now my fear increases. The room falls silent. Suddenly, a searing pain convulses my body as blow after blow is struck with cable. What you say? What you say? I cry into the covering. Oh God, let this pain cease. What manner of person can so treat another human being to such indignity and pain? Stand, I cannot. Arms lift me to my feet and drag me back into chains, back into the night, back into the living death. I recount that poem because in some part it illustrates the uncertainty of each day. One never knew whether one was going to be called out and receive a different form of torture. One never knew if one was going to see the end of the day. I faced a mock execution. They came into the cell and they said, "You have 5 hours to live." I had read many years previously some of the writings of the late Carl Jung, the Swiss psychotherapist. And I recollect Jung saying, if you're in a situation of extremity, allow your body to come to your aid and it will. Words to that effect. I think I experienced something of what he meant by that at this point. They said, "You have 5 hours." And I simply lay on the floor and I slept. It was as though I was being given respite at that point. After what was about 5 hours, they came, they undid the chains and they took me into the next room. I was blindfolded, of course. When anyone came in the room, I had to be blindfolded. I never saw anyone for almost 5 years. There were many people in that room next door. And I stood there, and my throat had gone dry from fear. It wasn't fear of death. Certainly I didn't want to die at that point, without my family or friends knowing how I had spent my last hours. The fear was, how will I die? Will it hurt? Will they behead me? Will they shoot me? How? They asked me if I wanted anything. I asked for a drink and I got it. They said, "Anything more?" I asked to write a letter, or some letters, to my family and friends. They brought me a pencil and paper. The only time, twice I had pencil and paper in the whole years, 5 years. And I wrote a composite message to the different people whom I wanted to communicate with. Anything further? Yes, I said, I'd like to say a prayer. You can. And so I said the Lord's Prayer out loud. strange feeling at this point. From the one side of me, I felt as though I was afraid and hesitant. And yet it seemed as though, at another point, I was standing outside myself, looking down at myself, and saying from the outside, "You're speaking very confidently and very boldly." It's very difficult to interpret and express what I felt at a point where I was fairly convinced I was in my last moments on earth. It's almost like, one might say, an out-of-body experience. They put the gun or metal to my head. I assume it was a gun. And then they dropped it and said another time. That was the end of torture. I was supposed to go home then. They told me I could go home. They believed me. But because of some circumstances in the outside world, I didn't and was returned to normal hostage accommodation. I had no idea how long that would be. The days went into weeks, the weeks went into years. I had no idea. And somehow I felt I had to find a way of surviving. Now, I'd always been a reader. I had read widely. And I had also been, as a child, in a school where we had to learn by rote, verse, poetry. And I had a store in my mind. And somehow I was able to draw on that store and able to begin to write in my head. I began to write, and I found I also could exercise and develop my memory. And memory was strange in that experience. I could remember, for example, with absolute clarity, the children who were in my class in primary school. I could remember their names, I could see their faces. I could not remember for one moment how I had come to establish contact with my captors. That had gone from memory. It was almost as though there were holes in memory. And my interpretation of it later was this, that I was being given access to more supportive memories from the past, and that more painful memories, for a period, were being obliterated. Because at a later stage, I could remember with absolute clarity how I had come to establish contact. I was grateful that I had been brought up in a church where there was the regular use of language. I'd been a chorister. I can't remember from those days one sentence from a sermon I heard, ever. But I could remember and had stored in my mind the collects, the prayers, the services of the church, through repeating them regularly, Sunday by Sunday. And somehow this enabled me to have a structure within. I could say, I refuse to engage in extempore prayer, which something would go something like, "Oh God, get me out of here." Because I felt if I did that, I would simply become a poor specimen of humanity. But I could say what I had remembered from those years when structured language was there for me. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all the perils and dangers of this night. A simple prayer that has meaning when you're in the dark, and when you're afraid. But more than that, it has the harmony and rhythm of language of poetry. And one of the things I was trying to do, and one of the things I believe, is that good language, like good music, has a capacity to breathe harmony into the soul. You ask me for a definition of soul, I can't give it to you. All I can say is, for me, in that situation, I use that term to designate the total person that I am. You may take my body, you have captured me physically, but you will not capture me completely, because my soul lies in the hand of God. A very, very simple affirmation. But it was that affirmation for me, maybe different for others, that enabled me to maintain hope. And there is a key, I think, to surviving in these situations, to maintain hope and to be able to recognize that in this day, in that situation, you still have life. I had to learn again how to live for the moment, not to think too far ahead. I had to, and did, put my family and friends right to the back of my mind. I didn't think about them a great deal, deliberately, because that would have been too upsetting. And somehow I was unable to do that. And I also discovered that in this situation, it was possible to be creative. I said to myself, in life, you have made many journeys. You have traveled the world. That has stopped for the moment. Now is a time to take an interior journey, to get to know yourself better, to discover more of yourself. Of course, anyone who does that will discover the two sides of character, the light and the dark, good or evil, call it what you will. The danger of doing such a journey alone is that when you inevitably come across the dark side, you can so easily fall into depression. And one has to remember that one is simply the same as all human beings, and that what one is seeking for is inner harmony, a balance, not to exclude the dark totally, not to say I'm living totally in the light, which is an impossibility, but somehow to find that degree of inner harmony which enables even the most extreme and unpleasant situation in some way to be a creative situation. I have got on for too long, and I hope that you will draw from this, and in your questioning, draw from the others some of the things that were taking place. Looking back on the experience, it's not something that I would wish to go through again. Of course not. But I don't regret it, because in some strange way, it has given me a new understanding of myself. I was able to exercise my brain, such as it is. I have no great brain. I am not in any way, I cannot compare myself for one moment with the experts with whom I sit here this evening on this platform. I am a very ordinary sort of person. And yet somehow I discovered that in this journey, this inner journey, my brain could be utilized could be exercised and needed to be exercised. And as one did that in a variety of ways, through language, through other exercises, one was able to survive and hopefully, yes, definitely, to look back on the experience and say, it was an experience of suffering. Of course it was. But it has convinced me that in the vast majority of cases, suffering, which is common to all human beings, need not destroy. Normally, and in many instances, out of suffering, something creative may emerge. Thank you very much.
An incredible man and an incredible story. Inspirational. Come on, give him some questions. He would love that. Is there somebody there? Please, just stand up and say your name, who you are, please. Thank you very much. It's always dreadful to be the first person, so I'm sincerely thanks to you.
That's all right. I graduated from this university about 100 years ago. Whoops. Very proud to do so. Terry Waite, thank you very much for your enormous modesty and humility. Did you manage at all to establish any sort of daily routine that was comforting or helpful? Thank you.
That's a lovely question. Thank you very much indeed. Come on, Terry.
What I found was this, that first of all, being in complete darkness, as I was at certain periods for several days, was extremely disorientating, simply because I could not get a routine or a structure. I'd wake up perhaps at, I don't know what time it was, it could have been in the middle of the night, and I'd think it was the morning. And I just got completely lost. Mercifully, to be in the complete darkness didn't last all that long. But then, when I was moved to other places, it was possible to get a structure to the day simply because I was kept near to a mosque. And I got the call from the minaret at morning, daybreak, noon, and dusk. And that gave me a pattern for the day. And I found it important to build a pattern for the day so that I would put a period of time aside to think along certain lines, to exercise my brain, I suppose, a certain time for writing, and so on. And also I found it was important to have ritual behavior. Now, my ritual behavior was, as an Anglican, I would save a little bread from my supper, and I'd have a little water in the cup, and I would say to myself the communion service. Now, I'm not a clergyman, but I'd say to myself, that in saying that service, following that ritual behavior, in my imagination also, I was linking myself with others on the outside who were saying the same service. And I'd locate myself in my imagination, for example, in a cathedral I'd known or a parish church I'd known. And somehow, using imagination and following ritual behavior to give me a sense of position and identity. And those things just came naturally to me in that situation.
When you said you were writing, Terry, that wasn't physically with a pencil and paper, though, was it? That was
No, there was only pencil and paper was there twice in the whole experience. The one amusing story, if I may tell you, the one was the death threat, which when I wrote the letter. The other was, they came to me, what I missed more than anything else were books. And I used to plead with my guards to bring me books. And they wouldn't. They said, we've never read a book in our lives. Why would you want a book? The only book we've read is the Quran. But I found a kindly guard, and he said, I'll try and get you a book. But he didn't know what to buy because he couldn't read English, and he couldn't be seen going to an English location to get an English book. So he worked through a series of cutouts. Someone would get a book, pass it down the line, and eventually he brought it to me. This was after about 3.5 years, 4 years. One day he came into the cell, and of course I had my blindfold on, and he dropped a book by my side. When he went out, I picked the book up, took my blindfold off, picked the book up, and laughed out loud because unknown to himself, he brought me Great Escapes by Eric. And this was Escapes from Prison Camp. It's perfectly true.
But your writings were writing your book in your head, is that right?
Oh, yes. But the next book he brought me was even more terrible. It was a manual of breastfeeding. Yes. Now, when he brought me Dr. Spock, Baby and Childcare, I thought, oh dear, someone at the other end of the line has got fastened onto the childcare shelf. How can I get them off that onto something more interesting? And now this is when the pencil and paper came in, because I asked for pencil and paper. I got it the second time, and looking beneath the blindfold, I drew on that bit of paper, as best I could, the picture of a penguin. I said, if you see a penguin on the front of a book, buy it. Be a good book. Penguin books. And it worked. I mean, a couple of weeks later, I got the very appropriately titled book, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning by Laurie Lee. And Penguin book, which I'd read years previously. But it did show me also the importance of the trademark, the symbol. How the symbol communicates across barriers, language barriers, and actually worked in that particular situation. And I think Penguin Books have been very foolish to remove the penguin from many of their books these days.
Right, have we got another question?
Sorry, a long-winded answer. I do beg your pardon. Yeah.
Yes, right in the front here, please.
Being such a big man, you must have suffered greatly.
From what?
Could you hear that at the
Oh,
back?
yes. Yeah, well...
Terry, let's just repeat the question, because he didn't have a mic. Being such a big man, did he really suffer? Well, he must have suffered in such a small...
There were many ways of moving...
Or when... Yeah. Tell them, Terry.
Well, there were many ways of being moved. Sometimes, always, you were wrapped in masking tape from head to toe. When they moved me, it was a good day for the masking tape industry in Beirut. Because sometimes hostages were put in a pipe, a metal pipe, strapped beneath a lorry and driven across town. The worst occasion for me was they tried to get me in a chest, a trunk, and they couldn't because, as you say, I'm tall and my knees were sticking up. So they said, I heard someone say, clear the fridge. And there was a big American refrigerator in the room. So they cleared it, and I said, you can't put me in there, I'll suffocate. They said, no, you'll be okay, it won't be long. So they pushed me in the masking tape, and I was in there, and it was terrible, because all the pressure was on my knees. And it was hot. Eventually, it was cold to begin with, but I managed to get the tape off my hands and press the seal, and I felt air come in. But it was an eerie journey because we were driven across town, put on a lorry, driven to some other location. On the last weeks of captivity, I was moved to be with other hostages, just for a few weeks. And on this occasion, they bound me in masking tape and threw me into the back boot of a car, which was another common way of moving you, a Mercedes, into the back of the... And I landed in there, all taped up, and I discovered there was another body in there. And I managed to get the tape again off my hands and mouth, and I said, not much room in here. And the voice came back and said, until you came in, there was plenty of room. And that was my first meeting with John McCarthy. Oh, we met in the back of a car. Dear old John. Yeah, that's the first meeting. The most bizarre one was when I was being moved at night, and they dressed me as, believe it or not, an Islamic woman with the burqa, 6'7" Islamic woman, and took me across town that particular way. So, yeah, it was interesting. Yeah.
Sense of humour was important.
Absolutely. Sense of humour is important.
Yeah. Lady here, please.
You mentioned a few moments ago that you were writing, yet you've told us you had virtually no access to paper and pencil. Could you explain how you were doing that? You were composing, or could you just tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, this would be an interesting one for my colleagues to comment on after I've made my, what I would say. It wasn't writing with pen because there was no pen. There was no paper. There was nothing for over 4 years. The writing, as I put it, writing, took place entirely in my head. I began to write poetry for the first time in my life. And many of in the book that I quoted from, Out of the Silence, some of the verse which goes across life in there had its genesis in those days, had its beginnings there. And it was all done here, and I found that I could develop and expand my memory, not simply with words. Now, I've always been appallingly bad at mathematics, but I thought, here's a chance now, exercise your brain a bit. And so I used to do simple stuff that anybody can do with pencil and paper, complicated multiplication, not complicated, but long multiplication. Just a series of numbers, and then trying to remember the numbers and coming back to them again, and proving them from different ways, as a way of keeping my brain alive, exercising my brain. And I did that quite a lot. And sometimes I got so engrossed in that, that I went on all day and all night, couldn't sleep, because I was so active inwardly, working my brain, trying to expand it. Well, I think that's what I was doing. I wasn't conscious that I was trying to expand it at the time, but I knew that I had to keep mentally alive, and that was a way of doing it. So the writing here again, the writing of verse, the writing of the book, Taken on Trust, the writing of verse, Out of the Silence, all that took place here. And then when I came out of captivity, I was elected to a fellowship at Trinity Hall, Cambridge. And there I sat in that room with a blank pad before me and a pencil for the first time in years. And I began to put on paper that which I had years ago then done in captivity. And I found it was there. My editor at the time said, when I read parts of it to him as I went through the book, he said, "You have chosen a very ambitious structure." He said, "Be prepared for rewriting." And when we came to the end of the book, he said, "No rewriting, fine." So somehow one had been able, my brain had been able to do it. I've never written a book before, but my brain had been able to do that, and I've been able to use it in that way. And I'm sure my colleagues here will be able to comment on that.
Well, my view would be that by repeating your life, by the focus you had in that solitude, and reprogramming the brain with all of that knowledge, that then became the substance of what you were able to recall when you eventually sat at Trinity and wrote it down. So I think it's constantly reprogramming the brain into those things that you...
So the brain can be reprogrammed in this way,
no question. Yeah. I think, would you agree with that, Richard?
Well, I was just wondering whether I should put my son into captivity to improve his but probably sorry to...
Yes.
Probably not, no.
Yes.
I mean, I think that from the point of view of the memory processes you were using, did you go over passages in your mind multiple times as you were thinking it out? I mean, we talk about that technically as consolidation. I'm wondering whether you were deliberately, composing some bit and then consolidating it over several days or months.
I did.
Yes.
I did.
Yes.
I went back and forth, back and
Yes.
forth. But it was all to keep, to keep my mind alive, really.
Yes, yes.
This is what it felt. And I was tremendously encouraged when I read, my situation, of course, is extreme, but there are many people who've been through far worse situations. And I was very encouraged when I read the writings of Tony Judd. Tony Judd was a social historian who has written extensively a very good book on the history of Europe. But he developed motor neuron disease. And in his latter years, as he was becoming paralyzed, he wrote a very fine little book, entirely different than his social history. It's called The Memory Chalet. And in that book, as he's lying prone, dictating as best he could to someone by his side, he goes back across life, and he's able to recall from past experiences and recall them in the most poignant way. And I was struck by it because that's exactly what happened to me. Exactly. And I didn't read Tony Judd until much later on. I mean, his experience of having motor neuron disease was many years after my captivity. But I saw the parallel between the two experiences.
Terry, did you know that you must keep the brain going, or do you think it was a natural defense mechanism coming into play?
I think it's partly both. I knew that I had to survive.
Yeah.
And I suppose I recognized that there was a limit to how I could survive physically, because there was no exercise. And you'd see your skin go white, and you'd lose muscle tone, and you would see yourself getting old before your time. But on the other hand, there was no limit to what I could do with my brain, so to speak. Yeah. Well, the limit was my own capacity, my own understanding, my own ignorance. But I could stretch it in a way that I couldn't stretch and utilize my body.
Yeah.
So that was the difference.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when you're in a limited situation, you find that your brain will come to your aid, or can come to your aid, if you will allow it, and if you will exercise it.
That's a wonderful message for all of us, I think. I think there was a question, a lot of questions now. There, and then we've got 3 here. You're going to have to speed up, because we've got Terry, short and sharp, and then we can get right round the Right,
yes,
please.
Hello. I'm interested to know, and this question's slightly linked to the last one, when you were, did you try to structure your thoughts? So, for example, to think, well, today I'll try and think about everything related to Shakespeare or something like that. And if you didn't, what did you think about for 24 hours a day for 4 years?
How did I determine which topics to work on? Well, I used to put the earlier part of the day, for as far as possible, quiet meditation, if you like, contemplation. There's plenty of opportunity for that, but to make a deliberate effort in that direction, not to allow my mind to wander, as a way of focusing. And then I would allow so much time to say, right, now you're going to concentrate on X, Y, whatever, writing or whatever it was. And then a period of time for exercise. Now, what exercise can you do when you chained up, but I had read many years previously the Canadian Book of Air Force Exercises, which was exercises that could be done whilst you're in the pilot's seat of a plane or in the co-pilot, you know, and there are things you can do. And I'd remembered that, and so I used to do that. So yes, in part, yes. But I wasn't over strict about it. I also allowed my mind to wander and ramble. But at times I had to discipline it also, so that I wouldn't, in fact, be led off a trail, which led me into panic. And so I had to control it to a certain extent as well.
Right. Yes, first you and then you.
How difficult was it to adjust to normal life once you'd been released?
What a good question.
Someone said to me, when you come out of a situation of trauma or from a traumatic experience, take it as though you're coming up from the seabed. If you come up too quickly, you'll get the bends. And so I was advised to come out gently and to take it one step at a time. I was also advised to, as were my family, and it's just as difficult for family as it is for hostage, which is one reason why I set up Hostage UK some years ago to give support to families. And I was able, as were my family, to tell the story, if you like, before trained listeners. And I think the simple theory behind that, really, is that if you tell the story soon after the experience, rather than push it down, you're able to manage it rather than being managed by it. And many people have said to me, Japanese prisoners of war, they were told to be quiet. They never were told not to speak about it. And they were. Many of them did not speak about it. And some people said, well, they managed perfectly well. But the answer is they did not manage all that well.
No, they didn't.
I've been patron of the Far Eastern prisoners of war and also of the children of the Far Eastern prisoners of war. And you speak with the children, and they will tell you, almost without exception, that at the middle age, their fathers began to suffer flashbacks, nightmares, and there was a strain in the family as a result of this experience because they pushed it down and it hadn't, and then it began to manage them at a later stage rather than being managing it reasonably well. And so it took time, and things are never the same because one has changed, the family have changed, but we've not been broken by the experience. We've moved on with it. And there are, as I said, there are many, many people who have far more difficult experiences to cope with. People who've been long-term prisoners, and so on and so forth. People do it very successfully.
You've been back to Beirut too, haven't you?
Yeah.
And met your captors.
Yes, I went back because I've often thought, what it is that ordinary people can do to promote peace. And I've said, naively, if only people who've had enmity one with another, if only they could sit down, face each other, agree to put the past in the past, and there'd be a possibility of having a political settlement. Because there can be no political settlement unless people on the ground have a relationship of trust. Now, I said, this sounds very naive, and it's easy to sit on a platform like tonight and say it, but you better do something about it. So years later, I went back to Beirut. I went at night to see my captors. They were surprised to see me after all those years. But they had moved on. I had moved on. And I sat opposite one of the leaders and I said what I've said to you. And he said, well, what can we do? So I said, I've just come from the Syrian border. I've seen people who are ill and despairing because they've left their homes. They're cold. Can you let me have heating oil for them? He said, yes, we'll do it. And as far as I know, he did it. But it's only a simple gesture. But just think, if 10,000 people from the occupied territories and 10,000 people in Israel had the opportunity to sit together, took that opportunity, you'd have a basis for a political settlement. So let nobody ever say there's nothing that ordinary people can't do to bring about peace in the world. Brilliant. It does lie, we have a responsibility, we can do it.
Yes.
We should do it.
Yes. Yeah, please. Oh, yes, you, please.
Yeah, good.
Oh, I knew you'd take over this little job. I get too immersed in it. Right, yes, let's have you.
Hi. Terry, you said that poetry, which you'd learned at school... Can you hear better without the mic?
Yeah, that's better. That's better, yeah.
Better without. Better without.
You said that poetry that you learned at school helped to sustain you, and I guess part of that was because you were trying to recall it. But was there one particular poem that was either a favourite or one that you found helped you in a helpful mood? One particular poem?
Your childhood poem.
A thing of beauty is a joy forever, its loveliness increaseth, it will never fade into nothingness, but will keep a bar quiet for us, full of sweet dreams and quiet breathing. Therefore on the morrow we are wreathed, and so on and so on. It goes on and on. Keats. I remember that very well.
You had a very intellectual childhood if you read Keats.
Yeah. I will read you one, if I may, from the end of this book. This is the last one. But I read it because you said it's the end, and it is the end, and it should be. It's just a little epitaph. Do not forget me when I'm old. Do not forget that we loved with a passion that took us away from this world, lost in each other, lost in a realm where in giving we received more than we could ever hope for. Do not forget me when I've departed this life. Hold me in your heart, for we shall be together, and death will not part. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, as a very, very old alumni of Leeds, I want to send you on your way because you are on a life's journey. And I want every one of you to develop your brain, to stretch your brain, and above all, to protect your brain. Travel well, and thank you very, very much for coming to meet this incredible man. Lisa, over to you for some housekeeping, I think.
Thank you. Can I just say a massive thank you. Truly inspiring evening, I'm sure you will all agree. And I'm sure you'll all agree that you feel the same as me, truly privileged to have heard you share your story and your experiences with us, Terry. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you also to Richard, to Trevor, and to Mary for perfectly chairing this evening. Thank you. Can I just say, please do go and enjoy the reception afterwards over in Parkinson Court again. Please go and speak to some of our researchers. But also, Terry will be at the back of the hall to sign books and speak to people after, as you leave. So please do take the time to say hello to Terry and talk to him more if you wish. Thank you very much for joining us at the university.